Today we are going to talk about the Irish slavery meme. All these images support the idea that Irish people, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, were sent to the Americas as slaves. Now, way back in the 17th century, there were many types of unfree persons. There were slaves, there were serfs, there were criminals, there were a myriad of others. We're going to look at two very specific ones here as relevant to this topic. We're going to look at indentured servants and chattel slaves. An indentured servant was generally a European who paid for their passage to the New World by agreeing to work for someone for 2 to 7 years. Now, there were indentured servants who were criminals or political prisoners or just poor people who were forcibly transplanted to the New World. And life for these people was not necessarily easy. They could have poor accommodation, they could have poor diets, they could be whipped, they could be fined, they could have their indenture extended. What is important to note is that the indenture itself was the property of the master, not the person. The Irish slavery meme tends to focus a lot on Irish people sent to the Caribbean. And if you were a political prisoner, for example, you could be sent off without any limit on your indenture. However, upon their arrival in Barbados, and this was a legal requirement, they were given a period of service based on their age. During their indenture, there were limits placed on these people. For example, they couldn't engage in commerce, they couldn't own guns, they couldn't command ships, and they couldn't get married. And while many did die from the hardships they endured, indentured servants were not servants for life. When their period of indenture was up, those people were free. At the end of an indenture, a servant would get what was called their freedom dues, which could be property, it could be money, but most importantly what they got was freedom. They became free members of society. Chattel slaves, on the other hand, were livestock. They were listed amongst inventories of cattle. Children of chattel slaves themselves became slaves. Life was brutal, harsh, and there was no chance of freedom. This meme perpetuates the idea that Irish slaves had the worst possible existence, and now, while the life of an indentured servant was not easy, the prime punishment for an indentured servant was the extension of their indenture. Yes, they could be whipped for assaulting their master, or they could be fined for a number of other things, but make no odds about it, chattel slaves had it far worse. The difference between the two is enshrined in the 1661 Barbados Slave Act, which sought to create a distinction between master, servant, and slave. Following that act, if a servant died, a master could not bury them unless the justice of the peace and 2 neighbours had seen the body. There was no such protection for African slaves. If a slave died, it wasn't a crime. A slave could be killed by anyone, even an Irish servant, for stealing.